The moment Nadia Briar pressed her hands against the wound in Aurelian Dragomir's chest and felt his heart stuttering beneath her palms like a dying bird trapped in a cathedral bell, she knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. "Get her out of here," snarled Veracus, the head of the Vampire Council, his silver robes dark with someone else's blood, his pale face twisted with contempt. "The human healer is compromised. She is too emotionally involved to be trusted with a guard of his rank." "I am not leaving him," Nadia said. Her voice did not shake. That surprised even her. The grand chamber of the Dragomir court pulsed with ancient power. Chandeliers made of black iron and moonstone hung above her head, their light cold and indifferent. 12 members of the Midnight Council stood in a semicircle around the dying form of Aurelian Dragomir, first guard of the court, the most feared enforcer of vampire blood law in the Northern Territories, and the man who had, 3 months ago, saved Nadia's life without being asked and without expecting anything in return. He lay on the obsidian floor, white hair fanned around his head like frost on winter stone. His skin, always pale as bone, had gone translucent. She could see the faint violet of veins beneath it. His eyes, when they opened to find hers, were the color of old amber, and they held something in them that the council could not see and would not have understood even if they could. They held trust. "Briar," his voice came out as barely a thread. "You should go. You said that to me once before," she told him, pressing harder against the wound, feeling the wet heat of it against her fingers. "In the alley on Vordrecht Street. I did not go then, either." Something moved across his face, something close to a smile, ruined by pain. Veracus stepped forward. "This is a violation of the ancient vow between our court and the Healers' Guild. Human practitioners are permitted access to our halls under strict emotional neutrality. If she has formed a personal attachment to, she is saving his life," said a low, quiet voice from the doorway. Every head turned. Nadia did not turn. She kept her hands exactly where they were, kept her breathing steady, kept her focus locked on the task of pulling Aurelian Dragomir back from whatever dark threshold he was standing on. But she heard the footsteps, measured and unhurried, cross the obsidian floor. She heard the council shuffle backward without a word. She heard the silence that preceded power like a cold front before a storm. Nadia Dragomir, matriarch of the court and Aurelian sovereign, stopped 2 feet behind Nadia and said nothing for a long moment. "Is she doing what I think she is doing?" Cassia asked quietly. "She is attempting a blood anchor technique," said the court physician Thessaly, who stood off to one side, wringing her pale hands. "It requires a significant emotional connection between the healer and the patient. It has not been performed on a vampire in over 3 centuries. The last human who attempted it died from the psychic feedback." "Then why?" Cassia said. "Is she still doing it?" Nadia answered for herself. "Because he is not going to die," she said. "Not tonight. Not like this. Not because someone wanted to make a point about who is expendable." The word hung in the chamber. Expendable. Nadia had figured it out 20 minutes ago, when she had arrived at the court on an emergency summons and found Aurelian on the floor, with a wound that should not have been possible, made by a blade that should not have existed inside these walls. She had figured it out because she had spent 3 months learning this court, learning its politics, learning who was afraid of Aurelian's loyalty to the matriarch and who stood to gain if that loyalty was permanently severed. She had figured it out because she was too emotionally involved, and being too emotionally involved meant she had paid attention. It had been 3 months since she first walked through the iron gates of the Dragomir court, newly contracted to the Healers Guild's most difficult placement, telling herself it was just a job. She had been 26 years old, fresh from 2 years working trauma medicine in a city hospital that serviced both human and vampire populations under the Accord of 1987, the treaty that had opened coexistence between species under strictly regulated terms. She had her certification, her kit, and a reputation for being clinical, precise, and professionally detached. She had lasted exactly 4 days being professionally detached. On the 4th day, she had been called to treat a junior court member for a minor injury and had taken a wrong turn in the labyrinthine halls of the court's underground palace, which sprawled beneath the old industrial district of the city like a cathedral turned upside down. She had ended up in a corridor she was not supposed to be in, and she had heard voices, and her clinical training had engaged before her common sense could stop it. She had pushed open a door and found 3 older court vampires systematically destroying a younger one's belongings while he stood silent and still and did not defend himself because the blood law of precedence forbade him from raising a hand against those of higher caste without formal challenge. She had said, with the particular tone she had developed, treating difficult patients at 3 in the morning, "Excuse me, is there a medical emergency here, or are you 3 just enjoying yourselves?" The silence that followed had been spectacular. Aurelian Dragomir had turned to look at her with those amber eyes, and even then, the first time she really saw him, she had understood that he was not a man who needed to be rescued. He was tall and severe and beautiful in the way of old stone architecture, built for permanence rather than comfort. His white hair was pulled back, his jaw was sharp, and the expression on his face was not relief or gratitude. It was something more complicated, something like being seen in a moment he had decided not to be seen in, and finding that the witness was unexpected. "The human healer appears to be lost," he had said to the 3 older vampires, with a courtesy so precise it could have been used as a weapon. "She is clearly in the wrong corridor," said one of them, a male Mail called Morek, who Nadia would later learn was Veracus's creature. "Then I will escort her out," Aurelian had said, and he had crossed the room, and the 3 vampires had stepped aside because whatever Aurelian Dragomir's caste limitations were, whatever the blood law said about precedence, he was first guard to the matriarch, and that meant something very specific about personal danger. He had walked her out of the corridor without a word. At the junction that branched back toward the medical wing, he had stopped and said, "You will not speak of what you saw." "I saw 3 adults tormenting a 4th, she said. "That is what I saw." His jaw had tightened. "It is more complicated than that." "It always is," she had said, and walked away. He had come to find her that evening, which she had not expected. He stood in the doorway of the small chamber she had been assigned near the medical wing, and he said, without preamble, "The 3 you saw are members of a faction that has been working against the matriarch's authority for 11 years. They target those under her protection as a method of demonstrating that her protection has limits. I am one of the targets because my loyalty to her is publicly known and politically inconvenient for them." Nadia had set down the report she was writing and looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked a question in that corridor, and I gave you an incomplete answer," he said. "I do not like incomplete answers." She had stared at him for a moment. "That is very honest. I am always honest," he said. "It is one of my few genuine virtues." She had laughed, which clearly surprised him. She watched it cross his face. that small flicker of being caught off guard quickly smoothed back to composure. "Nadia Briar," she had said, offering her hand. He had looked at it for a moment, the way someone looks at an unfamiliar custom being performed incorrectly, then taken it. His hand was cold, as all vampires ran cold, but his grip was deliberate and careful. "Aurelian Dragomir, I know who you are," she said. "You are the reason the council approved my placement here over the other 6 candidates. The matriarch's first guard reviewed the files. You were the most qualified," he said, releasing her hand. "I was the most likely to survive in a politically volatile court without causing a diplomatic incident," she corrected. Something moved in those amber eyes again. Something warm and very carefully contained. "That too," he said, "that it had been gradual. Not slow, exactly, because nothing about Aurelian was slow when it came to things that mattered, but layered. She would encounter him in the corridor after a difficult healing session, and he would fall into step beside her without being asked, as though escorting her were a natural extension of existing in the same space. She would mention, in passing, that she had not eaten because the kitchen schedule conflicted with a patient's treatment window, and the next evening a tray would appear on her desk with the particular precision of someone who had paid attention to what she ate and what she avoided. He would knock on her door at odd hours with questions that were clearly not the real reason he was there. She would let him in and answer the questions, and they would end up talking for 2 hours about vampire court politics, human medicine, the history of the Accord, the strange liminal space that both their lives occupied, her background in the complicated urban neighborhoods where human and vampire populations overlapped, his centuries of service to the Dragomir line before the concept of a city as she understood it existed. He was over 400 years old. She had done the math carefully when she first learned it, and then set the math aside, because the person sitting across from her, drinking nothing, watching her with those careful amber eyes while she described her grandmother's house in a small coastal town, was not a number. He was present in a way that very few people she had ever met were present. He listened the way people who have lived long enough to understand the value of a detention listen, like he was keeping everything she said. She had made the mistake of asking him about this once. "You remember everything, do not you?" she said. "Vampires do not lose memories the way humans do." "That is correct," he said. "So you will remember this conversation forever?" "Yes." She had sat with that for a moment. "That is either terrifying or beautiful," she finally said. "It is both," he said. "Most things are." She had looked at him across the table in the small sitting room they had claimed as an unofficial meeting place, this severe and ancient and startlingly honest man, and felt something in her chest shift in a way that should have alarmed her, and instead felt like settling. She had not said anything about it. He had not said anything about it. But the air between them had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it, because naming it would have made it real in ways that had consequences neither of them had mapped yet. The consequences had arrived on their own schedule, as consequences always did. 6 weeks into her placement, Nadia had been treating a young court member named Petra for a respiratory condition related to an old injury, when Petra, in the transparent way of people who want to tell you something and cannot be seen to tell you, mentioned that there were those in the court who found the human healer's closeness to the first guard problematic. "Problematic how?" Nadia asked. "The faction that has been working against the matriarch," Petra said carefully. They believe that the first guard has a vulnerability now, a human vulnerability. They believe it changes what is possible. Nadia finished dressing the wound she was working on before she spoke. Are you warning me? Petra met her eyes. I am telling you something I observed. What you do with it is your own matter. Nadia had gone to Aurelian that night. He had listened to her account without expression, and then said, with his precise and unnerving calmness, I know. You know, she repeated. I have known for approximately 3 weeks that Veracus and his faction have identified you as a potential pressure point, he said. I have been considering how to address it. Nadia felt a complicated thing move through her. You should have told me. I did not want to frighten you, Aurelian. She said his name and watched him respond to it the way he always did, that almost imperceptible stillness, like the word landed somewhere specific. I am not frightened easily, and I need accurate information to make informed choices. Those two things are both true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are right, I apologize. She had not expected the apology. She had not expected it to land as heavily as it did. 400 years of pride and certainty, and he said it simply and directly and meant it. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. He did. The picture that emerged was older and darker than Nadia had understood. Veracus's faction had been attempting to unseat the matriarch for over a decade through a sustained campaign of undermining her key loyalists, creating situations designed to expose vulnerability, and documenting each one as evidence of diminishing authority. They operated within the technical limits of blood law, because crossing those limits would give the matriarch grounds to act against them directly. So they stayed precisely at the edge, where the damage they caused could be attributed to natural court conflict. Aurelian was their primary target because he was the matriarch's most visible and effective defender. They had tried several approaches over the years. All had failed, because Aurelian was 400 years old and had no attachments they could use as leverage until Nadia. You realize what you have to say, Nadia said when he finished. I realize what it might seem I have to say, Aurelian said carefully, that my continued presence here creates a danger for you. His eyes held hers. Yes, and is that what you want to say? The silence stretched out between them. The underground palace breathed around them, stone and old magic and centuries of accumulated weight. No, he said finally, it is not, she breathed. Okay, this is not a simple situation, he said. I want you to understand that I am aware of what my honesty costs you. It does not cost me anything, she said. It gives me the ability to make a real choice. I choose to stay. I choose to do my job. And I choose to be careful. Something moved in his face again, that warm, contained thing. You are remarkable, he said quietly. I am practical, she said. But she felt the warmth of it travel through her like good light. That had been 6 weeks ago. In the weeks between, they had both been careful, and they had both, she thought, also been fully aware that being careful was not the same as being safe, because the thing between them had continued to grow with complete indifference to the political situation around it. He had started to touch her, not in ways that announced themselves. A hand at her back when he guided her through a crowded court corridor, present and steady and there. Fingers that rested near her hand on the table when they talked and did not quite touch, but occupied the exact space that touching would require. The brush of his arm against her shoulder when he leaned over to look at the medical report she was explaining. Cold cloth against warm skin, and neither of them moved away. She had come to his chambers one evening to tell him something about a patient, and found him standing at the window that looked up through reinforced glass at the street level grating above, watching rain move across the pavement, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him before he knew she was there. She had seen the loneliness of it, the magnificent isolation of a man who had lived 4 centuries and found himself in the company of one particular mortal, uncertain. He had turned as if he sensed her presence, which he probably had, and his expression in the moment before he composed it had been so unguarded that she had to look away to give him a chance to reassemble himself. "It is raining," she said, because she needed to say something. "Yes," he said, "I have always found it beautiful. I can hear it, but not feel it from here." She had crossed the room without thinking about it, and stood beside him at the window. And they had both looked up at the rain moving over the grate, and she had said, "When I was a child, I used to stand in rain until my mother dragged me. Inside, she said, I would catch my death. Did you?" "No. Though I caught a rather spectacular cold." He had made a sound that was almost a laugh, and she had looked at him sideways, and he was looking at her, not at the rain anymore, and the distance between them was very small, and the air was full of something that had been building for weeks. "Nadia," he said. His voice was different. "Lower. Careful in a new way." "I know," she said. "I am not certain you do. Tell me then." He had looked at her for a long moment, those amber eyes moving over her face with that absolute attention that she had come to understand was his particular form of saying something without words. Then he said, "I have lived 4 centuries without wanting to bring anyone into my world the way I want to bring you into mine. I am aware that this is inconvenient. I am aware that it creates danger. I am aware that you are human and mortal, and that you will age and eventually die while I continue, and that this is a grief neither of us can entirely reason our way around." "And?" she said. "And I find myself profoundly unwilling to care about any of that," he said, "which is not a sentiment I have ever had before." She had reached up and put her hand against his face, cold, pale cheek against her warm palm, and he had closed his eyes for a moment with an expression that undid something in her chest. "I am not asking you for anything," he said without opening his eyes. "I know," she said. "I am giving it freely." He had opened his eyes and looked at her, and then he had kissed her, which was gentle and devastating in equal measure, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head as though she were something precious, his lips cold and careful and asking rather than taking, and she had kissed him back and felt the whole architecture of her carefully maintained professional detachment finish its very quiet collapse. She had told no one. Neither had he. They were careful. They were smart. They met in private, and they were correct and courteous in public, and they both understood that the situation required this, because the faction would use it the moment they could. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because Verekas had not been watching what they did. He had been watching what Nadia was. He had watched her replace her professional detachment with something real and present and human, watched her learn the court's rhythms and its people with the same intensity she applied to everything, watched her speak up when she saw injustice and ask questions no one else asked and care about outcomes beyond the clinical. He had watched her become embedded, and he had understood that embedded meant invested, and invested meant vulnerable. He had simply been wrong about which vulnerability he intended to exploit. The blade used on Aurelian was old, pre-accord, treated with a compound that disrupted vampire healing, which was why the wound was not closing. It had been left in his path at a moment precisely calibrated when the guard schedule created a 30-second window where no witnesses were present. And Aurelian, who was 400 years old and had survived an extraordinary number of attempts on his life, had missed it because he had been thinking about something else. He told Nadia this later, and she had asked what he had been thinking about, and even in his weakened state, he had managed to look faintly embarrassed by his own answer. "You," he said, "you had left a book in the sitting room. I was going to return it to you." She had looked at the wound under her hands and thought about a 400-year-old vampire almost dying because he was thinking about returning a book to her, and felt the full weight of loving someone settle over her. She pressed her hands harder against the wound and thought, with everything she had, not about technique or procedure, but about him, about the amber eyes and the precise honesty and the cold hand against her face and the rain visible through the grate and the way his voice changed when he said her name. She pulled all of it into her palms and pushed it into the broken place in his chest. The blood anchor technique that the court physician said required a significant emotional connection and had not been performed in 3 centuries. She had asked about it once, in a purely academic context, 3 weeks into her placement, because she was thorough and she read everything in the court's medical archive. The principle was this: vampires healed through a combination of blood and the ambient field of their own vital energy, which was why disrupting compounds worked on them. If a healer with sufficient emotional resonance to the patient could generate a counter field, an external source of the same energy frequency, it could bridge the disrupted healing and restart the process. The healer experienced it as an intense emotional expenditure rather than a physical one, which was why the last practitioner to attempt it had died. She had felt the patient's death as her own. The patient had survived. Nadia had thought about this once, considered it academically, and then filed it away. She had not thought about it again until she was standing in the court chamber, with her hands against Aurelian's chest, and the counsel telling her to step aside, and she had understood with sudden clarity why she had memorized it so completely. She pushed. It was like opening a door she had not known was in herself. It was like pouring everything she had learned to feel in the past 3 months into a form that his body could receive. It was not comfortable. It was not graceful. It felt like standing in a current of water strong enough to move stone, and she was the channel for it, and the channel was not designed for this volume. She heard Nadia Dragomir behind her say, very quietly, "Everyone, out of this chamber." Now, she heard the counsel leave, heard Veracas's protesting voice cut off mid-sentence by a door closing with the finality of a sovereign's command. She heard the court physician say something, and Nadia say something back, and then there was quiet. "You need to stop," Aurelian said. His voice was clearer, not strong yet, but clearer. "Nadia, the feedback will—" "I know what the feedback will do," she said. "Stop talking. You are stubborn," he said. 4 centuries, and that is your medical assessment. Nadia." His hand came up and closed around her wrist, his grip still weak but deliberate. "If you die doing this, I will not recover from it. Do you understand me? If you die, there is no version of survival that I want." She looked up at him. His eyes were open and focused on her, amber and clear and absolutely present. "Then I had better not die," she said. She pushed again. The feedback hit her like a wave hitting a cliff, massive and cold, and carrying the full weight of his injury reflected back. And she understood in that moment why the last healer died. It was like touching someone else's death with your bare hands and having it recognize you. She felt it travel up her arms and into her chest and grip her heart with fingers of ice. But she was not the last healer. The last healer had been treating a stranger. Nadia was treating Aurelian Dragomir, who was looking at her with those amber eyes, and whose hand was around her wrist, and whose voice she could still hear saying her name, and those things were louder than the cold. She held on, and then, like a lock releasing, like a key finding the right alignment, the field connected. She felt it happen. The disruptive compound in the wound began to lose the argument it was having with his body's healing. She felt the resistance change, felt it shift from pushing against nothing to pushing against something that was pushing back. She poured herself into that something and held it steady. The wound began to close. It took 7 minutes. She knew because she counted her own heartbeats, counting them deliberately to make sure they continued. When the skin under her hands sealed shut, she sat back on her heels and breathed, and then put both hands on the floor because the room had gone sideways. Nadia. His voice was sharp with alarm. He was sitting up. He was sitting up on his own, which meant it had worked, which meant... "Give me a moment," she said. He was off the floor and beside her before she finished the sentence, which was impressive for a man who had been dying 40 minutes ago. His arms came around her and held her in a way that announced very clearly he did not care who saw it. His face was pressed against her hair. "You are the most terrifying person I have ever known," he said into her hair. "And I fought in a war in the 15th century. I am fine," she said. And she was, mostly. The feedback had left her feeling as though she had run a very long distance in very cold weather. But she was present, and her heart was beating, and her thoughts were clear. "You knew the theory," he said. "There is a meaningful gap between knowing the theory and Aurelian." She pulled back enough to look at him. His color was still pale, paler than usual, but his eyes were clear. She checked his pulse on instinct, pressing her fingers to his wrist, and found it steady. "You are all right." He looked at her fingers on his wrist, then at her face, and something raw crossed his expression. "Because of you." "Because you stayed present," she said. "You kept talking. You kept your eyes on me. That mattered." "I could not look away from you," he said simply. The chamber door opened and Nadia Dragomir entered alone. The matriarch was striking in the way all vampires were striking, white-haired and regal, her face carrying the layered gravity of centuries, and she looked at Nadia and Aurelian with an expression that was quietly complicated. "She saved your life," Nadia said to Aurelian. "Not a question." "Yes," he said, using a technique that requires the kind of emotional connection the council spent the last 2 hours, insisting she does not have. "Also yes." Nadia looked at Nadia. "Are you injured?" "No," Nadia said. Tired, the feedback was significant but not lethal. Nadia said, "The difference from the historical case is the quality of the connection. It is not just emotional intensity. It is specificity. It is knowing the person. The more you know them, the more you can calibrate the counterfield to their specific frequency instead of guessing at it." The last healer was treating a stranger. The mathematics were different. Nadia was quiet for a moment. "You have been studying this." "I study everything in the archive," Nadia said. "It is my job to be prepared." "And you prepared specifically for this?" "I prepared because it seemed like it might become irrelevant," Nadia said carefully. The matriarch looked at her for a long moment, with the kind of look that saw several layers down. Then she looked at Aurelian, who had not released Nadia from the loose but immovable circle of his arms. "Veracus," Nadia said, will argue that the blade that injured you was brought in by a court member from outside the faction. He will claim no knowledge. He will be lying, Aurelian said. Yes, but proving it is another matter. Cassia moved to the obsidian table at the room's center and stood with her hands flat on its surface, thinking. What he did not anticipate is that Nadia's knowledge of this court is now significantly more detailed than he knows. 3 months of access to every person who comes through the medical wing means 3 months of conversation that never happens under scrutiny. Nadia straightened slowly. I have been paying attention. I imagine you have, Cassia said. I know which members of the faction visit the court physician and for what conditions, Nadia said. I know their movements because people talk to their healer the way they talk to no one else. I know that Morek has been in the court pharmacy twice in the past month, asking for compounds that have no medical application I can identify. I know that 2 junior members of the faction have been treating a particular kind of hand wound consistent with blade handling. I have documented all of it. The silence in the chamber was very complete. You documented it, Cassia said. In code, Nadia said, in the margin notes of my patient records. Nothing readable without the key, which is in my memory. I started doing it 4 weeks ago when I understood what the faction was building toward. Aurelian had gone very still beside her. Why did you not bring this to me? He asked quietly. She looked at him. Because if I brought it to you and you acted on it before it was complete, they would deny it and adapt. I needed the record to be airtight before it was useful. And because I did not want to give you the burden of knowing what I was doing when you had enough to carry. That was my decision to make, he said. I know, she said, and I will be more communicative in future, but I was right that it needed to be complete. And it is complete now. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, You were building a case. You were gathering evidence for 3 months. Alone. I was doing my job, she said, and protecting something that matters to me. He closed his eyes. His jaw worked once. Cassia was watching them both with an expression that had something almost gentle in it. Beneath the layers of sovereign authority. Nadia Briar, she said. The council insisted you were too emotionally involved to be trusted with Aurelian's care. They were arguing for your removal from this court entirely, framed as a concern for your well-being and the guild's standards of neutrality. I know, Nadia said. They were wrong, Cassia said simply. Your involvement is the only reason my first guard is alive tonight. And your involvement has produced a case against the faction that I could not have built through official channels because the faction controls 2 of the 3 investigators I have available to me. She straightened. I will need that case, Nadia, all of it. Tonight, you will have it, Nadia said. What followed was not comfortable and was not fast, but it was thorough. Nadia spent 4 hours with Cassia and the court's 2 unbought investigators, translating her coded margin notes into a formal account, walking them through the timeline, explaining the medical significance of each observation, identifying the connections she had drawn between seemingly unrelated details. Aurelian was present throughout, seated close enough that she could feel the steady cold of him, occasionally adding context from his own knowledge of the faction's history. The 2 of them working together with the fluencies of people who had spent months learning each other's minds. At one point, around the 3rd hour, one of the investigators said, somewhat carefully, This is a remarkably thorough record for a medical professional operating outside her formal investigative role. She is remarkably thorough, Aurelian said, before Nadia could answer, with the quiet finality of someone who is also saying something else. The investigator looked between them and did not ask any further questions about Nadia's motivation. When it was complete, Cassia had what she needed. The case was presented to the full council at a session convened at dawn, which Nadia attended in a formal capacity as the guild's representative, seated 3 seats from Aurelian across a table of pale and ancient faces. The session was long and formal and in places very cold, but Cassia presented the evidence with the precision of someone who had survived 4 centuries of court politics and knew exactly how to deploy information for maximum effect. Vereka sat through it with the controlled expression of a man calculating rapidly. He had clearly not anticipated that his chosen method of demonstrating the matriarchs of vulnerability would produce this. He had expected a healer sent away in disgrace and a first guard destabilized by the threat against someone he cared for. He had not expected the healer to have spent 3 months quietly building the noose that was now around his neck. He made 2 attempts to redirect blame before the evidence made that impossible. He made one attempt to argue that the evidence was improperly obtained, and therefore inadmissible under blood law, which Cassia addressed by noting that the Accord of 1987 specifically granted human medical personnel operating within vampire court facilities the right to document anything observed in their professional capacity, which included observations made during medical care. Nadia had read that provision very carefully 4 weeks ago. When she first understood what she was doing and needed to know whether it would hold. At the end of the session, Verikas and 4 members of his inner faction were removed from the council under the ancient vow of accountability, which in blood law terms meant their court authority was suspended, pending a formal tribunal. Morek and 2 others were placed under house sanction. The faction was not destroyed, because courts did not work that way, and Cassia was too intelligent to martyrize them, but it was reduced to something that would take years to recover to functional strength. Nadia walked out of the session into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and let herself feel tired. Aurelian appeared beside her without announcement, as he often did, and stood close enough that she could lean into him without technically leaning. "You have been awake for 22 hours, he said. "You have been awake for longer," she said. "And you were recently stabbed. I heal, you almost did not." He was quiet, then he said, "No, I almost did not." She turned her head to look at him. His profile was severe against the stone corridor, the old iron lighting throwing shadows across the high planes of his face. He was put back together now, back to the composed and regal presence she had first seen in that corridor 3 months ago, except that she knew now what was underneath it. "You told me once," she said, "that you did not want to bring anyone into your world the way you wanted to bring me in. And then you said you were profoundly unwilling to care about the complications." "I remember," he said. "The complications are significant," she said. "There are going to be more of them. The faction lost this round, but they are not gone. The council will be watched the matriarch's human healer very carefully now. The guild is going to have opinions, and the question of what I am to you is one that the blood law does not have a category for. I am aware of all of this," he said. "Good," she said. "I wanted to make sure we are both clear-eyed." He turned to look at her. "Are you asking me whether I still want to be clear-eyed about you?" "I am asking whether the complications make you want to reconsider." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long, and then he said, "Nadia, I lay on that floor and heard the council telling you to leave, and heard you say you were not going, and I felt something that I can only describe as the clearest sensation I have experienced in 400 years of existence. It was the certainty that you were real and present, and choosing me in a room full of people who were choosing other things. She let that land know, he said. The complications do not make me want to reconsider. They make me want to be worthy of the fact that you went through them for me. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at her hand in his, then looked at her, and the controlled warmth she was used to seeing carefully and often contained in those amber eyes was not very contained right now. "Come on," she said. "I am going to make you sit while I do a proper assessment of that wound, and then we are both going to sleep." "In that order?" he said. "In that order," she confirmed. He walked with her, their hands still joined, down the corridor of the underground palace, past the iron-lit walls and the old stone and the portraits of centuries of Dragomir lords and sovereigns, and she thought about how strange and specific and entirely improbable it was that this was her life, and found that she was grateful for it. The assessment took 40 minutes because she was thorough. The wound had healed cleanly, the disrupting compound fully neutralized, the tissue repair complete with no scarring, which was still extraordinary to her, even after 3 months of watching vampire physiology work. Aurelian submitted to the examination with the patience of a man who understood this was not optional, and also, she suspected, with a particular kind of quiet pleasure in her attention. When she set down her instruments, he said, "You have not stopped moving since the chamber." "I have been focused on outcomes," she said. And now she looked at him. "Now I am tired." He had arranged, without asking, for her to have the larger chamber adjacent to his own, rather than the small medical wing room she had been using, and she had discovered this when he walked her at the door and opened it, and she found her things already moved inside. She had looked at this, and then looked at him. "I arranged it last week," he said, without any particular inflection. "I intended to ask you first. I apologize for the presumption." "You intended to ask," she repeated. "Events intervened," he said. She looked at the room, which was 3 times the size of her previous one, and had a proper window and a desk large enough to actually work at, and said, "It is a very nice room. You deserve a nice room," he said. "You deserve considerably more than a nice room." She turned back to him. He was standing in the doorway, the corridor light behind him, very tall and pale and watchful, and she crossed the distance between them and put her arms around him, face against his chest, and felt his arms come around her immediately, automatically, with the certainty of someone who has been waiting for the moment to be allowed. "We are going to figure this out," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "Yes," he said, "we are. The guild standards on emotional neutrality are largely outdated and have been challenged before on human rights grounds," she said. "I looked into it. The Accord has provisions for professional relationships that develop in the course of extended placement. The blood law on human-vampire personal relationships is complicated but not prohibitive. I have read everything I could find." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been researching this." "I have been researching this for about 6 weeks," she said. Another quiet moment. Then she felt the movement of his breath, slower and fuller than usual, the particular quality of breathing that meant something was being felt rather than thought. "I love you," he said. It was entirely without fanfare. It was just stated, clear and direct, and exactly like him, and she felt it in every part of her. "I know," she said, and then, because she meant it, and because he deserved to hear it in full, I love you too." He held her more firmly, his chin resting on the top of her head, and she stood in the arms of an ancient and dangerous and profoundly honorable man, and thought that being too emotionally involved was perhaps the best professional mistake she had ever made. The tribunal for Veracruz and his faction was convened 4 weeks later before the full Northern Court, a gathering that drew vampires from courts across the region, which meant the underground palace was full of white-haired and amber-eyed strangers in expensive dark clothing, and the political temperature was elevated enough that Nadia felt it on her skin. Cassia had asked Nadia to present her evidence formally before the tribunal. The request had come in a private meeting at which Aurelian was also present, and it had been offered genuinely, not as a command, with full acknowledgement that accepting meant Nadia's role in the court's internal politics would become publicly impossible to recharacterize as neutral. "If you present this evidence," Cassia had said, "every court in the Northern Territory will know that a human healer gathered it. Some of those courts will view it as a violation of the Accord's terms on human practitioners. There may be pressure from the Guild. You should know all of this before you decide." Nadia had thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to. "I will present it." Aurelian had not said anything at the time. Later, when they were alone, he had said, "You do not have to prove anything." "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm finishing what I started, and I am not going to hide from it because it is inconvenient." He had looked at her for a long moment. "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "I am the most practically obstinate person you know," she corrected. "There is a difference." "In your case," he said, "I am not certain there is." She had laughed and leaned into him on the small sofa in her new chamber, and he had put his arm around her, and they had stayed like that for a while, reading, comfortable in the particular way of people who have stopped performing ease and simply arrived at it. The tribunal was held in the grand chamber, rearranged for formal proceedings, with representatives of 7 courts seated in tiered rows and the accused standing before a panel of senior blood law arbiters. Nadia sat in a witness position to one side, in the formal grey of the Healers' Guild, aware of every eye in the room. She presented her evidence clearly and without embellishment. She explained her methodology, her reasoning, the applicable Accord provisions, and the significance of each documented observation. She answered questions from the arbiters and from the defense representatives without losing the thread of her logic or the steadiness of her voice. There was one moment when a defense representative attempted to characterize her work as evidence of dangerous personal entanglement, suggesting that her findings were motivated by a personal relationship with the injured party rather than professional responsibility. Nadia said, "My personal relationship with the First Guard meant that I had sufficient reason to take the faction's behavior seriously. It is correct that professional neutrality would not have produced the same level of attention. However, the evidence itself is documented, verifiable, and legally gathered under Accord provisions. The motivation for gathering it does not change what it shows. If the defense would like to challenge the evidence on its merits, I am prepared to go through it in as much detail as necessary." The defense representative did not take her up on that. The tribunal found against Veracruz and the core faction members on 6 counts of seditious conduct under blood law. Sentences ranged from permanent removal from the court to extended exile from the Northern Territories. Marek received the latter, which was not as satisfying as Nadia would have preferred, but it was significant. The faction, its structure dismantled and its key members removed, would not recover in any meaningful political sense. After the tribunal adjourned, Cassia found Nadia in the corridor before she could disappear back to the medical wing and said, without ceremony, "I am formally revising your placement contract to reflect an extended and permanent tenure, with full court access equivalent to a senior court member and a retainer from the court supplementary to your guild fee." Nadia blinked. "Non-negotiable," Cassia said pleasantly. "And I am personally contacting the guild's regional director to inform her that the emotional neutrality standard, as applied to extended placement practitioners, is being formally challenged by this court under Accord Article 17. I have read the challenge precedents. They are favorable." Nadia stood in the corridor of an underground vampire palace and felt unexpectedly moved. "Thank you," she said. Cassia looked at her with those layered, ancient eyes. "You saved my first guard's life and dismantled a decade-long campaign against my court. The thanks are mine." She paused. "I have known Aurelian for a very long time. He has not been easy to know. He is rigorous and private, and he holds things at a distance because he has lived long enough to understand what loss costs. I watched him stop doing that the moment you walked into this court." Another pause. "He will protect you with everything he has as long as he has it. That is not nothing." "I know," Nadia said. "Good," Cassia said, and walked away with the decisive, unhurried step of someone who has accomplished what they came to do. The weeks that followed were not perfect. The guild sent a representative who spent 2 uncomfortable hours with Nadia reviewing the neutrality standards, and Nadia spent 2 uncomfortable hours making a very detailed and well-sourced argument about why those standards were not applicable in her specific situation and should be revised in general. She won the argument, not because she was spectacular, but because she was right and had done the research. The representative left saying the matter would be reviewed at the next guild board meeting, which was not a victory, but was not a defeat. The other northern courts adjusted to the new reality with varying degrees of grace. 2 courts sent formal objections to the Dragomir court's political entanglement with a human practitioner. 1 court sent what could, if you tilted your head and were generous, be interpreted as congratulations. The rest watched and waited, which was what courts did. None of it changed the fundamental shape of things. Nadia learned the court in winter, when the underground palace was warmest, and she learned it as herself, not as a carefully neutral professional, but as someone who genuinely occupied the space. She learned the names and histories of the people she treated, and the particular nature of each one's pride, which mattered in vampire care in ways that had no human equivalent. She learned the rhythms of court life, its formal occasions and its private ones, the coded language of status and alliance, and the genuine warmth that existed beneath it in pockets, if you knew where to look. She and Aurelian learned each other with the same thoroughness they had applied to everything else. She learned that he read more than she had expected, and had strong opinions about literature that dated back to when the literature was new, and that discussing those opinions could apparently go on for hours if she let it. She learned that he had a particular precise way of existing in space, like he had made a private agreement with gravity, and that this dissolved slightly in her presence in ways she found deeply endearing. She learned that he showed concern through action rather than statement, appearing with tea when she was working late, or standing in the doorway of the medical wing when a treatment had run long, as though proximity were its own form of reassurance. She learned that he had a sense of humor that was extremely dry and usually deployed at exactly the moment she needed to laugh, and that he was proud of this but would not admit it. He learned, she thought, equal things about her. He learned that her stubbornness was real and not performative, and that arguing with it was not productive, but being honest with it worked every time. He learnt that she needed to understand how things worked on a level that went beyond what was strictly necessary, that she asked the second and third and fourth question after everyone else had stopped, and that this was not a habit she was going to change, and was also the reason she was very good at her job. He learned that she found the court genuinely interesting rather than intimidating, which seemed to both please and puzzle him. "Most people find us frightening," he said once. "Most people do not spend enough time with you to get past the presentation," she said. "We are also genuinely dangerous," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I trust you're dangerous toward me." He had looked at her with something that might, in a less contained man, have been described as undone. There was an evening in early spring when they went up to the surface, which happened sometimes when the timing was right, the court's surface access points allowing careful emergence after dark. The city above was loud and lit and indifferent, and they walked through a neighborhood where Nadia had grown up, which she had not been to in several years, and she showed him the building where she had lived, and the corner where she had stood in the rain, and the small park where she had spent most of the summer she was 9. He listened to all of it with the same attention he gave everything, asking occasional questions that were specific and observant. And she felt the particular pleasure of being known in motion, of someone adding new detail to the picture they were building of who she was. At the corner of the old street, she stopped and looked up at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary with clouds and the city light, layers of orange and violet. "I used to think I would live somewhere like this always," she said. Small neighborhood, same streets, and now, he said, she looked at him. He was watching the sky also, his profile clear against the urban glow, and he was so completely himself. This ancient and measured and beloved person, standing on a street corner in the modern city like he belonged to every century simultaneously. "Now I live underground," she said, "which I did not predict, and I find I do not mind at all." He looked at her. "You could have a life above ground," he said. "It is worth saying that. I would not keep you from it." "I know," she said, "but my life is not above or below ground, Aurelian. My life is where the people I love are." He was quiet. The city moved around them. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be transparent about the fact that I have been thinking about how to ask it for several weeks." She felt warmth move through her. "You have been thinking about it for several weeks?" "I am thorough," he said. "No," she said. "Ask." He turned to face her fully on the corner of the old street in the orange and violet light, and the composed and ancient severity of his face was entirely underlaid by something that was neither composed nor ancient, but was very simply and completely sincere. The blood law has a category for human companions of court members, which is old and imperfect, and does not capture what I am asking, but is the closest available structure, he said. It grants permanence of place, formal recognition of standing, and protections under court authority. It would also formalize what you already are to this court and to me, which is not a small thing in political terms. He paused. But what I actually mean is something simpler than the law and larger than the court. I mean that I want to be with you in every sense that those words can hold. I mean that the 400 years before you feel pale and far away by comparison, and the indefinite years ahead of me feel like something I want to spend near you. I mean that I love you in a way that is not complicated by the fact that it is also inconvenient. She was going to say something, and found that her throat was not cooperating, which was unusual and entirely Aurelian's fault. I mean, he said, will you stay? Not as the guild's healer in a contracted placement. Will you stay as mine? She reached up and put both hands on either side of his face, holding him as she had on the evening of rain and windows, and looked at him for a moment in all his pale and severe and honest beauty. Yes, she said, without conditions and without reservation. Yes. He closed his eyes. She saw his chest move with the full and deliberate breath. When he opened his eyes, the amber was very bright, and the warmth in them was not contained at all. He kissed her on the corner of the old street under the layered city sky, cold and careful and certain, and she kissed him back with everything she had. Behind them, the city continued its indifferent progress. Above them, a gap in the clouds showed 3 or 4 stars, which was impressive for a city sky. I want to tell you something, she said, when they finally broke apart. Tell me, he said. I came to this court expecting to survive it professionally, she said. I had a plan for professional neutrality, and it lasted 4 days. I had a plan for not getting attached, and it lasted approximately 1 hallway conversation. I had no plan for this, I know, he said. Neither did I. And I am glad, she said, that neither of us had a plan for this. I am glad the plan failed. You are glad you are emotionally involved, he said, with the particular dry quality that meant he was amused. The council said I was too emotionally involved, she said. They were wrong about the 2. He looked at her for a moment. They were wrong about a great many things, he said. That was perhaps the most consequential error among them. She laughed, and he smiled, which was still one of the rarest and most remarkable things she had seen in the underground palace. This precise and ancient man's face opening into something uncalculated. She took his hand, and they walked back through the neighborhood and down through the court's surface access and into the underground palace, into the warmth and iron light and old stone of a world that was not what she had expected her life to be, and was entirely, specifically, perfectly hers. Cassia, when she saw them return, said nothing, but she nodded once, with the gravity of someone acknowledging something complete. That night, Nadia sat at the large desk in the chamber that was now unambiguously her own, and began drafting a formal paper for the Healers Guild on the clinical and technical basis for the blood anchor technique, including the conditions under which it could be successfully performed, and the distinction between emotional involvement that compromised care and emotional involvement that enabled care unavailable through any other method. She cited the historical case, the modern case, and her own physiological data from the experience. She worked for 3 hours, then stopped and went to find Aurelian, who was at the window of his chamber, looking up through the grate at the street above, which he did sometimes in the particular way of someone who is comfortable with what they have chosen, but still pays attention to the larger world. She stood in the doorway, and he turned at her approach, and his expression when he saw her was the same as it had been on the corner, and the same as it had been in the old corridor before she knew what it meant, and the same as it had been every time she had walked into a room where he was, which was the expression of a person for whom her presence was simply and completely good. Still working? He asked. Finished for tonight, she said. I am writing a paper on the blood anchor technique. he said. "How did you know?" "Because you finished something significant, and you are the kind of person who immediately begins building from it," he said. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him. "You know me very well. I am working on knowing you better," he said. "It is a long-term project." "How long-term?" He considered this with the seriousness of someone performing a genuine calculation. "Indefinitely," he said, "if that is acceptable." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and they both looked up through the grate at the street above, where rain had begun to move across the pavement in the particular way of spring rain, light and present. "I can hear it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Next time it rains when we can go up," she said. "I want to stand in it." "We can do that," he said. "You will not enjoy it," she said. "You do not feel temperature the way I do." "No," he said. "But I will enjoy watching you enjoy it. That has its own value." She looked at him sideways. "That might be the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I have said considerably more romantic things," he said with dignity. "You have said more elaborate things," she said. "That was the most romantic." He looked at her for a moment. Then he conceded, with the particular grace of someone who has decided that being right is less important than being honest, perhaps. She took his hand and held it, cold and deliberate and known, and they stood together at the window while the rain moved over the grate above them, neither above ground nor fully below it, neither fully in one world or the other, but entirely and completely together in the particular space they had made between the two. Outside, the city carried on. The Dragomir court breathed around them. The cases were resolved. The tribunal was concluded. The guild paper was half written. The blood law had been bent in directions no one had anticipated, and would continue to be, and the world would adjust because it had no other option. Nadia Briar, who everyone had said was too emotionally involved, stood in the underground palace she had made her home and felt the full weight of what she had built here. Not despite being too emotionally involved, but entirely because of it. She had come here as a healer. She had become something more, not less of what she was, but more. As though the pressed against her, and she had pressed back, and they had both changed in the meeting. She had kept her precision and her thoroughness, and her willingness to ask the fourth question after everyone else had stopped. She had kept her ability to stand in a room full of ancient authority and say clearly what she thought was true. She had kept everything she came with, and she had gained this: the iron light, the stone corridors, the cold hand in hers, the amber eyes that looked at her with 4 centuries of careful attention, the court that was hers now, formally and truly, the people in it who had become her people, the work she was doing, the paper she was writing, the argument she was building for a guild that needed to understand the difference between neutrality and distance. She had gained a man who stood at a window, watching rain he could not feel, and turned when she entered the room, as though turning were simply the natural response to her presence, and said true things directly, and held her with the deliberate certainty of someone who understood the value of what they held. "Aurelian," she said. "Nadia," he said, "I am glad I stayed." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old world and gentle, and against the back of her hand she felt him smile. "So am I," he said, "every day. So am I." The rain continued over the grate. The court breathed around them. Old stone and iron light and centuries of history making room very quietly for something new. Above, the city moved in its indifferent modern way, and below it, 2 people who had not planned any of this stood together in the space between worlds and found that it was exactly enough. Not a perfect world, not a simple love, not a life without danger or complexity, or the ongoing work of navigating everything their particular pairing required of them both, but real, present, chosen with full information and without reservation, and absolutely, entirely, irrevocably worth it.